Recording in progress.
No. Are we all set? Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Again, this is the panel entitled What Policies Are Needed for CTE to Work. We just heard a presentation on one model for CTE, right? This was Career and Technical Education. We just heard the first presentation this morning. So you can work that into the discussion today. We can ask the panelists if they think that Sandifer's model at Acton Academy is the future of CTE. And we have a great panel. We've got, I'm not going to go into all of their accomplishments. They're in the folder that you all have. And we'll go in order according to the schedule. And our panelists are Shaun Dougherty at Boston College, Jamie Gass at the Pioneer Institute, and Mikko Silliman at Aalto University from Finland. So thank you for joining us, and we will start with Shaun.
Great. Thanks very much. Pleased to be here with you this morning. Just going to... Yeah, is that better? Okay, excellent. Let's see if I know.
Yeah, let's get that mic right up there.
And to advance the slides.
The green one.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, so short amount of time, so I will try to give you the high-level overview of what we have learned so far about the impact and potential for career and technical education in U.S. public high schools, by and large, is where we have the evidence so far, though there are opportunities to connect it to the emerging school models. And even within the public sector, I would say there's variations on models that I'll try to point out and connect it to the evidence so far. I'm going to jump past that and sort of orient you. I think the first talk, the keynote this morning here highlights some of the most innovative space outside of traditional public school models. I would say by and large, high school career and technical education or secondary career and technical education takes place in three different places. The most common is in comprehensive high schools, so your traditional residentially assigned high schools that offer a range of activities and students take elective courses. There are also regional technical centers where multiple communities share a school campus where students attend those schools part-time, so half of the day they'll spend on their core academics in their residentially assigned school and the other half in these centers. And then whole school models of CTE that are the least common, but where we have some of the best evidence, in part because many of those schools have become quite popular, and so we have the conditions for random or pseudo-random assignment to those schools where we can learn what we've learned, say, about the impact of charter schools in some sense. So I'm skipping past some other more additional models. Career academies have also proliferated. They've been around for 50 years, but they've proliferated of late, so sort of career-themed academies within schools. By and large, those are in comprehensive high schools, but take on slightly different models. And then linked learning is a less scaled approach to sort of integrating applied learning into traditional curriculum. So if you use these as mental models for sort of what exists in the wild in the US at the moment, you have some sense of where the evidence will derive. So I'm going to talk about three different types of outcomes: high school outcomes, post-secondary outcomes, and workforce outcomes in terms of what we know. So whole school models of career and technical education. So the least common, the 3 to 5% of students who are being served, we have very strong evidence that of improved graduation outcomes, in particular for males whose outcomes are well below the average otherwise. And this evidence derives from here in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in New York City, and to a lesser extent in California, where there's sort of an exception. But these whole school models mostly exist in the northeastern United States, and so are somewhat exceptional in the national context. Importantly, there's no difference in student learning outcomes as measured by standardized tests, and so even though students are spending a decent amount of time outside of their core academics, they're sort of equivalent learning outcomes in those settings. Similarly for attendance. And then I think importantly, if we think about the range of benefits, students with disabilities seem to benefit disproportionately in a number of settings. Again, that sort of comes up across multiple models, across multiple state contexts. Where we expect the outcomes perhaps most obviously in workforce outcomes, so when education is applied to or connected to work, students tend to learn work skills, and the benefits of those work skills have shown up quite substantially. In these whole school models, we see benefits of like on the order of 30 to 40% higher earnings through age 23. In the US, that's about as far as we can see students into their sort of early adult life, given the limits of data, but these are pretty large impacts relative to sort of any other similar intervention, and again, without the trade-off of differences in academics. Where I think there's important policy conversation and nuance to tease out, especially with respect to these whole school models of CTE, are in the post-secondary outcomes. And whether or not you think students should be going to college after doing a particular program in high school could depend on a lot of things, but part of how they should be related probably is connected to whether or not students intend to pursue a pathway that actually aligns with college going. So if you want to be a plumber, enrolling in a four-year college is probably not the right way to go. Same for HVAC technician, et cetera. However, if what you want to do is pursue a degree in nursing, you might end up either immediately or eventually in a 2 or 4 year nursing program. And so I think the top level finding is, does CTE lead to differences in college going? The answer is it depends on whether or not those programs seem to be aligned with the college pathway. So to just point this out, here's an example, a figure from some work here in Massachusetts where the different plotted points correspond to different career and technical education pathways. So healthcare all the way to the left, and transportation all the way to the right. This includes like automotive and transportation and logistics. So while students in healthcare programs are 15 percentage points more likely to ever enroll in college, students who are in the transportation pathways are 15 percentage points less likely to ever enroll in college, and a lot of variation in between. And so sort of what you think should be the right outcome, I think should probably depend on whether or not programs are intended to be aligned with workforce outcomes, direct workforce entry, or continuing in college. And if we look at 2-year college outcomes specifically, in general, there's sort of a positive association with college going, in part because these programs tend to be really connected to 2-year college offerings. Similar evidence in New York City. I won't get into the weeds here, but just to point out, again, we replicated. So the previous evidence was from Massachusetts. This is in New York City. The top line headline is programs that are aligned with jobs that require some college or more college tend to result in higher college going, but they get counterbalanced by the programs that don't. So if you're trying to look on average, it's deceiving, and I would argue not sort of the right way to ask the question when it comes to career and technical education. So where does that leave us at the moment? I think the evidence that I'm sharing suggests that technical education can be, public career and technical education can be beneficial to students. Most of this evidence is coming from oversubscribed career academies or these whole school models. And I'd say by and large, we know the least about the settings where technical education is the most common. And that's a challenge as we think about how we should frame the policy debate, though I think it presents an opportunity in that we know in these specialized schools or these particular school models that they can be particularly effective. And so creates an opportunity to go back to that first chart that points out the characteristics of those school types and to think about the potential to infuse those characteristics in either new school models or in school models that don't currently contain them. There's lots more research that could be done. I'll just point out that another policy challenge is related to personnel. There's plenty of coverage in the popular press about teacher shortages. It's especially difficult to convince someone who gets paid fairly well in the private sector to take those skills and come to a school and teach students how to do those things. There might be a degree of self-interest if they're trying to help maintain the pipeline of workers in their particular occupation. However, creativity around this about part-time staffing and or shared staffing is going to be especially important. And then finally, I'll just make the point that these programs tend to be more expensive on average. I have some slides that speak to that if folks want to talk about that in the Q&A. We have some evidence that even with that higher cost, in these specialized schools that we think it still pays off in general in terms of the public investment, but that is not a trivial consideration and presents the opportunity to really partner and or rely on the private sector for some of the most expensive inputs in that process. So I'll pause there and look forward to a conversation.
All right, thank you, Shaun. Jamie.
So thank you, Paul and Dan. Really appreciate the invitation to be here, and always want to thank Michael and Antonio for all their hard work to make this happen. So Massachusetts over the last 20, 30 years has gotten a lot of notoriety for the work that it's done in K-12 education reform, the success it's enjoyed on NAEP and TIMSS and PISA and others, charter schools, et cetera. But the one area that has sort of been underappreciated in a way has been the success of the Voc Tech schools, which are the group of pre-existing schools before ed reform in 1993 that, from my point of view, have made the most progress. There's just we produced a book a couple of years ago on it that culminated about 20 years of research on it. Some of the key sort of observations that we drew from it is that the state leadership and accountability matter, the relationship between occupational education and academic quality mattered. These are public schools of choice, that has mattered, and then the relationships with businesses and industries mattered. Going back to antiquity, people always said, that the lawgiver was a key in determining the direction and success of a civilization. That's John Adams there, a Gilbert Stuart portrait of it. I included this paragraph here. It's called the Cherish Cause from the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution. It's quite unique, right? The wisdom and knowledge and virtue as a principle to self-government, the interest of literature and science, and in the seminaries of them, Cambridge, University of Cambridge, that's Harvard, of course, and public schools and grammar schools. But I thought it was interesting that he included, really on the threshold of the Industrial Revolution, agriculture and arts, sciences, commerce, trades, and manufactures. A colleague of mine, Wilfred Savoy, career Voc Tech leader at Blue Hills Voc Tech School just outside of Boston, published a 600-page, very exhaustive, definitive book within the last year or so. And I won't go into a lot of the details of it, but it shows you that the policies that Massachusetts established almost a century ago, with some leadership from some governors, but also Paul Hannes, who I think is credited with being the founder of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, was really instrumental. I mean, of course, gubernatorial commissions don't always produce much, but in this case it did. And one of the things that it did is it established the Voc Tech schools in Massachusetts as independent schools that were really separate from the comprehensive high schools. That was something that across the country, as Voc Tech education began to grow, changed. The comprehensive folks sort of gradually folded the Voc Techs within it. But part of the uniqueness of many of the Voc Tech schools in Massachusetts has been their independence and their autonomy. And of course, some of the state policies in here in Massachusetts had some influence on some of the federal work. But the really kind of transformative moment for Massachusetts was the '93 Ed Reform Law with Bill Weld, Tom Birmingham, and Mark Roosevelt. They all had gone to either elite prep schools or high-quality Catholic schools and were graduates of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, deep grounding in the liberal arts. They had a very clear sense of what it is that they wanted K-12 education to look like. I think Tom Birmingham in particular he's a labor lawyer and a Rhodes Scholar. He had a really profound sense that he wanted all kids of all backgrounds to have the high quality liberal arts education that he had that sort of changed his life trajectory. And so the money, the sort of progressively spent money in exchange for the accountability was sort of the grand bargain. It was all state driven, very bipartisan. And the results kind of speak for themselves. The NAEP scores, the TIMSS, PISA, all of that followed on from this. But for our purposes, the conversation really turned on the voc tech schools who fought MCAS. They fought the state accountability pretty energetically, maybe more so than any group. But once they committed to it and realized that this was going to apply to them, they really took off. But it has been the high quality academic standards in English and math and science and history that were really put together by the Board of Education. We were lucky to have a really strong Board of Education, Jim Pizer, who is here at Harvard now, but provided an enormous amount of leadership, Sandra Stotsky, John Silber, Abigail Thurnston, Ed Delatra. These were big liberal arts folks, but they took a lot of slings and arrows from making the voc tech schools have to commit to the same academic standards and tests that the comprehensive schools. And so these are some of the results. You can see back when MCAS first came into place, late 90s, early 2000s, the gap between the comprehensive high schools and the career voc tech schools, both in English and in math, was pretty dramatic. And you see really quite quickly they bridged it. I mean, there's been a little bit of a downward tick as they've adopted a new test and because of COVID, but still pretty impressive that they've been able to accomplish these results. The way they've done it is that they really balance the coursework and the curriculum offering. So 1 week on the liberal arts or all of the academic subjects, the next week on the voc techs and their shops. And as it turns out, to be a plumber or a carpenter, you need to know how to read and write and do mathematics. And of course, if you want to own your own business someday, you've got to be able to communicate and have good communication skills. But there's lots of quotes like this from folks who initially were not that excited about having kids in voc tech schools read Shakespeare or Beowulf, but they began to realize that those sort of more complicated texts really help their students acquire better reading and math skills. So this is the enrollment over the last approximately 20 years or so. It's don't have the last couple years. I think it's actually even up towards 56,000. I think it's approximately 20% of the students in Massachusetts are in voc tech schools. But there's been a steady growth of it and popularity. The book that Fred Savoy did tells us that voc tech schools have had wait lists going back a long time, but the reality is that they were dumping grounds for largely special needs students. But now we produced this book just a couple of years ago. The wait list was about 6,000. Now it's up to 10,000. I mean, and there's really no end in sight. They're enormously popular here in the Commonwealth. Per pupil expending, this is definitely a more expensive model of education, and that's largely due to the cost of the shops and the machinery and all the shops themselves. But from my point of view, and we tend to be sort of pretty fiscally conservative watchdogs at Pioneer, it's money that's been pretty well spent. They really have done a remarkable and historic job here in the Commonwealth. One sort of shining example is the Worcester Tech School out in central Massachusetts. Again, I remember working out in Worcester for a think tank out there back 20-something years ago. It was really a kind of decrepit old building, but they built a new building. They had great leadership from the mayor of Worcester and from other people in the business community. And there's, in 2014, both Barack Obama and then Colin Powell both visited the school. You can see the graph there that shows the upward trajectory both in English and math, and they've also, their graduation rate is improved dramatically. Part of what's been great about this is that these are schools of choice, so kids pick them, they pick the schools themselves, and then they pick the program in which they enroll, and that double choice, I think, has a level of commitment to it that really matters. You can see they've accomplished these excellent academic results with pretty microscopic dropout rates. I mean, we're proud, we're Pioneer, we're big charter school supporters, it's part of our legacy. They do, the Voc Tech schools really deliver it. And again, they're doing this all while doing really double duty, both on the occupational education side and the academic side. This relationship with business, it's one that's been around for a century. They've got a general advisory committee that's aligned with the Voc Tech programs themselves and representatives from local businesses. And then they also have a program level too, so the shops themselves. And these seem like they would be sort of bureaucratic process, but the reality is that they're not. They're pretty connected with placing their students to the workforce, so they need to have constant feedback and input. And by statute and reg, they have to commit to that. And they also have the schools also have, 95% of the schools have these juniors and seniors participate in some kind of co-op. The one on the bottom the picture on the bottom is particularly interesting because people think of Voc Tech schools as pretty traditional. They are in many ways, but the Voc Tech schools have also kind of driven these successes, and then have also gone into life sciences and medical technical fields. The picture on the bottom is an ambulance half an ambulance in New Bedford that is really great for interactive work. Here's the post-grad plans. One of the criticisms is that they're actually sending more and more kids to college. I'm not sure that it's sort of being accused of your virtues, but they obviously do well in workforce placement and other areas. And the students in Massachusetts tend to do well nationally on the Skills USA. They really kind of run the table year in, year out. We even had a Voc Tech student who was chosen as a presidential scholar. And then finally, it's just some coverage of the book that we did with Jay Matthews. So, look forward to some questions.
All right, thank you, Amy. Mikko.
Thank you so much for having me here. Do you mind putting on the slides? Great, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Mikko Silliman. I'm an assistant professor at Aalto University. And I'm going to be zooming out a little bit from the United States, taking us to Europe, to Finland in particular. I'm going to show a piece of work that Hanna Virtanen and I, who's at the Research Institute for the Finnish Economy, ETLA, wrote a couple years ago. And it's an academic publication. I'm going to, please forgive me for walking through some graphs that are maybe more academic than they need to be, but I think they're going to make an important point. So let me start by zooming out. This is going to be the share of high school age students across OECD countries who are enrolled in vocational education. One country which is missing from this list is the United States. The reason it's missing is that there's actually no data at the national level on exactly what the vocational enrollment is. I heard someone say yesterday 2%. I heard someone else say 10%. I've read somewhere 24%. It all depends on how you define it. Elsewhere in the world, so let's just think about the OECD average, nearly 40% of high school students are in vocational programs. It varies a little bit from country to country what that means, but this is a substantial portion of students are enrolled in vocational schools. And what we can see is also super interesting, where in countries like the Czech Republic, you have more than 60, almost 70% of students in vocational programs. So there's huge variation, and clearly countries don't seem to know what the right answer is. And I think that actually speaks to what the academic debate also is on the subject. We don't have, until recently, we haven't had that strong empirical evidence to lead the way. So I'm going to be talking about Finland, where almost half, so 45% of 17-year-olds are enrolled in vocational programs. And education, of course, can shape our lives in many ways. One of them is going to be our earnings or our wage trajectories or our employment outcomes. It's going to be what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to be answering the question, what are the labor market returns to vocational secondary education? I'm going to start with theory. So we might think that vocational education might help people transition more quickly into the labor market, and it might sort of provide people with alternative pathways which better match their varied abilities and aspirations of different people. So one size doesn't fit all, and vocational education might help people enter the economy who might not want to go to college. At the same time, there might be negative impacts of vocational education in the long term if the specific skills that you learn go obsolete with technological progress, and if you don't have the strong foundational skills, which Jamie sort of talked about, math, English, or writing, reading, that help you adapt to changes in the economy. So what do we know about the empirics of the returns to vocational education over the life cycle? The short answer is we actually don't know that much. There have been sort of the first era of this research was trying to compare people who look similar in terms of some observable characteristics, let's say high school GPA or something like that. But a person with a high school GPA who, let's say, drops out, but has the same GPA as someone who doesn't, are going to be very different in unobservable characteristics. One might be more motivated than the other person. So we don't want to make those types of comparisons. They're going to be apples to oranges comparisons. So what some economists have been doing is have been comparing policy changes. When there's a change that shifts the size of the vocational sector, and then we see, okay, do people who are now entering the vocational programs, how are they doing? That used to be going to the academic. The challenge with these types of reforms is that when there are large reforms that shift both the size and the content of vocational education, two things are changing at once, and we're going to be conflating the two if we're trying to make comparisons. In some of the work that Shaun referred to, we're going to be in the United States, and really actually all of the sort of well-identified, this is economics lingo for sort of identifying the causal relationship between educational pathways and labor market outcomes. A lot of the well-identified work comes from the US, but we can only measure short-term outcomes. So we want to find some sort of a natural experiment that lets us isolate the causal effects of vocational education on long-term outcomes. And to do that, actually, we have to turn to outside the US, both because the data systems there are better and they go farther back, as well as that's where we have these types of programs at scale. So what we're going to do is basically be comparing people who just about are admitted to vocational programs versus those who are sort of denied admission or go to the academic program. When we comparing outcomes right at the admissions threshold, I'll get into that soon in what we do. But I do want to highlight that even this policy reform type evidence that we have, and that's what we've been leaning on largely, it comes from a handful of countries. These reforms have almost all been getting rid of an emphasis on vocational education because for a long time the sort of common wisdom was that vocational education was not good. Some of the more recent papers suggest that these reforms may actually have maybe harmed students, so maybe vocational education was good after all, but there's going to be a lot of moving parts. So what we're going to be doing, and the other thing I will say about these papers is that they tend to come from reforms from the 70s and 80s. One of the trade-offs with wanting long-term evidence is you have to go far back in time. So we want to find a sweet spot with how far do you have to go back, which is sort of still interesting but still relevant. So in our paper, we're going to be talking about this sort of, I'm going to argue it's a credible research design from Finland, and we're going to be looking at cohorts who are starting vocational school between 1996 and 2000. So it's going to be a while ago. Since then, they've cut funding for vocational education in Finland, so the education there might not be what it is in the cohorts we study, but this is what the educational system in Finland looks like. So people start school at age 7, they're in compulsory school through age 16, at which point they apply to either the general or vocational track of high school, and then both tracks sort of prepare you for tertiary education, though people from the general track, the academic track, are much more likely to go on average. I'm not going to say too much about actually the content. I want to show you some results. I'm not going to talk to you so much about what's going on in the Finnish vocational education system, but by and large, it actually looks a lot like Massachusetts. These schools are typically sort of standalone schools, but you also have these regional schools, and they pair foundational skills with applied content apprenticeships as well. So this is, I think, a key point, is where if you just look at the descriptive data, if you just look at earnings trajectories of vocational versus academic high school graduates, you're going to observe exactly in line with what the theory might have suggested, that people in the short term benefit from going to the vocational track. They earn more. Their peers who go to the academic track sort of don't earn as much. That might not be surprising because maybe they're in university at higher rates, etc. But by age 28 or so, those who go to the academic track overtake their peers in the vocational track and earns considerably more. And that gap will only grow through the late 30s. This is going to be misleading. As I said, if we're just going to look at this type of data, we're making apples to oranges comparisons. So what we want to think about is, like, these students are going to be different already before they apply to these tracks. If you look at people who only apply to the academic track, they have much higher GPAs. It's a 4 through 10 scale. People who are the academic track tend to have sort of 8.5 on their GPA average. Those who just apply to the vocational track have something like a 6 average. Those who apply to both tracks, and that's going to be the key for our study, is that they're going to have GPAs in the middle. They already start to look much more similar. We're going to be focused on the 20% of students who apply to both tracks. Most of those students are applying to the academic track as their first choice, and then sort of as their safety option, they're going to be applying to the vocational track. A tiny portion, so 2% of the full population, but 10% of this sort of joint application sample are going to have a preference for the vocational track, and they're going to be sort of pushed into the academic if they don't get in. So this is what it's going to look like. If you, for example, prefer the vocational track, your GPA in ninth grade is going to define your admissions, and if you have a GPA just over the admissions threshold, you're going to get into the vocational track, your preferred track. If you have a GPA right below that, you're going to be denied admissions. What we're going to do is compare the labor market outcomes at this same cutoff and see if there's a jump. We can do that for those who prefer the general track. It's a little bit, we just flip the axis here. So those who sort of get into their preferred track on the general track graph are on the left side of the cutoff, whereas those who are sort of on the right side are pushed into vocational against their will. But we're going to be aggregating these for some of our results and looking at what happens when you go to the vocational track. On average, people earn more. And the point estimate, it's about 5% of the earnings, average earnings at this margin. It doesn't seem to be getting any smaller with time, and there's no effect on employment. If anything, the months of employment seems to increase. So we're not sort of seeing this trade-off in the long term that people were fearing as economists. And actually, when we split the data now by preferences, we see something really interesting, whereas that the earnings effects are just enormous for the small minority of students who have a preference for the vocational track. So what this means is that being pushed into academic school against your will is really harmful. It's really harmful for your income trajectory, but it's actually shockingly bad for employment as well. So people are sort of 20% employed 2 months on average less per year if they're pushed into the academic track at age 16. When they know that their comparative advantage, their preference is for the vocational track. So these results suggest that there are sort of considerable benefits. And one thing which I want to also say is, even if you just focus on the people who have a preference for the academic track, again, these are the marginal students who are applying to both in the middle of the GPA distribution. They're typically not going to college. For them, the point estimate is also positive, suggesting that going to the vocational track would have been beneficial, even though that they didn't want to do that. So I've already said all the points here, so I'm going to close, but actually maybe I'm going to show you one more graph, which I saved for the next slide for the discussion, but I want to show this, which is the graph on the left is what I want to talk through, where if you just look at the income differences by middle school GPA and high school track, you see that those who have very high GPAs and go to the academic track of high school earn a lot. The slope between GPA and income is much more shallow for those in the vocational program, And for those with sort of not as strong academic performance in middle school, going to the vocational program might be really helpful. So I think we really want to think about how do we cater the types of programs that we have in secondary school in the United States to people based on the skills that they have, their preferences, and their comparative advantage. But I'll leave that there for questions. Thank you so much.
I think I'll open it up to Q&A right away. On there at the end.
I just have a quick question. It's kind of in response to when the superintendent spoke yesterday. One thing that he said that kind of concerned me or worried me was stretching school. I think he said from B to 14, like birth and having like, more high school. And I understand that I think his point was that it would offer more opportunity for kids to then kind of do vocational type training, I guess. I firmly believe that we're starting way too late then. I think kids as early as 13, 14 start to show and demonstrate these areas that they're really passionate about, that they should be able to jump into. And I'd love to know what you guys believe, just in terms of age and when we should start having kids jump into the things they're most passionate about.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I mean, one of the controversies here in Massachusetts is that as the voc tech schools have become more popular, the middle schools will not give them the voc tech schools access to those students. But I'll just anecdotally, I had some work done on a hot water heater recently. The young man who did the work said, I knew I wanted to do voc tech work when I was in 7th grade, and yet the voc tech school that he went to on Cape Cod only started in 9th grade. So I agree with you. I think it needs to start earlier because the reality is that kids have the interest in it, and they generally have a sense of that pretty much earlier than we tend to appreciate.
And I'll just add that in traditional public school alignment, students, if they're going to attend a high school that has a CTE focus, they have to make that decision with relatively limited information. And then pushing some exposure, at least into the earlier grades, will help them make a more informed decision for the next 4 years.
I think it's a super important question. I think there's no doubt that people need to specialize to be successful in their careers. The question, as you said, is about the time in. And it's been actually really hard to find empirical evidence on that. So there are some papers that suggest that tracking before high school or in middle school can be detrimental. So I think there's some papers from Germany that suggest that. There's not a lot of evidence about the optimal timing of tracking. My sense, based on these results, is that 16 is not too early. I don't know what the right age is, but maybe 14, 15, 16 could be in the right ballpark. But I think it depends on the type of program. So I don't think anyone would say that you should become a lawyer at age 16. And even probably between CTE programs, there's lots of variation in when the optimal tracking is for different programs.
All right. Well, I think heard this morning at the opening keynote was that they could start in kindergarten or something like that. Perhaps that was too optimistic. Yes.
So I was particularly interested in this conversation because I live in the South. We don't have the privilege of what you all have here in Massachusetts. CTE has been shuttled to the side, and I had the privilege of interviewing Temple Grandin on her new book about visual thinking just a month and a half ago. And she says that the fact that we don't offer CTE across the board, the fact that we're driving so many kids toward a college education is actually detrimental to the whole of our society. We're ending up having to export the things that we could manufacture and reproduce here because we don't have the skill set. So my question to the three of you is, how do we get regional creation of what you have here in Massachusetts in other states, because we don't see this kind of opportunity that you all have here?
So I'll just add two things. So I lived and worked in Tennessee for 4 years at Vanderbilt University and was doing this work in the Tennessee context. And I would say Tennessee is among, if not the most innovative, one of the most innovative states, because in Massachusetts, if we have about 20% of high schoolers in CTE, Tennessee has twice that rate. That's more similar to Michigan and Ohio. Oh, okay. And so I think part of it is recognizing the economic opportunity. So I think having state level leadership that recognizes the economic opportunity and then creates partnerships with business to generate these programs in ways that are positively reinforcing. So I imagine, in North Carolina, you could have, research triangle activity, you could have manufacturing, you could have different types of agriculture, et cetera. But I mean, Massachusetts has just got in at the ground floor in part because this is where the Industrial Revolution sort of got off in the U.S. But I mean, there are examples in Tennessee, Texas, and Kentucky, which has, a lot more rurality that they're trying to integrate into this work, is making good use of partnerships with community colleges to think about the sort of, across the continuum and making good use of scarce resources and spatial constraints.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm struck by is that this debate is, about liberal arts and Voc Tech. It's not a new one. It was actually framed 100 years ago by W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington about racial uplift. But one of the reasons why I put that slide in there about the 100 years or so ago where there was state level leadership is it does provide the sort of the larger context that this didn't fall from the sky. I mean, we would really like to export the Massachusetts model to other states because we feel like we've got a good story to tell. I will say that we're spending a lot. Massachusetts spends a lot per pupil, generally, and it spends even more for Voc Tech, and so it can be difficult, I think, to export it, but we love to do that, and I think the people in the Voc Tech community here in Massachusetts would like to do that because I think they see this as successful, and it's a great option for a lot of kids.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Two questions. One, I think it feels like the vocational education conversation has been limited to the construction skilled trades, plumbing, carpentry, et cetera, but it can extend beyond that into things like computer coding, robotics. You could become a pilot. So I'd be curious to hear more about the perspective on outcomes for maybe some of those other different vocational pathways. And then secondarily, as it relates to the results of boys, I'm curious on the construction skilled trades, what's the difference in outcomes between boys and girls?
So let me start. I know Shaun also has things to say on this. I didn't show you the sort of breakdown of programs that we have in Finland in terms of vocational education. The majority of them are actually in something like business, which was surprising to me. I also thought we're mostly talking about plumbers or carpenters. A lot of people are working in something like business. And this is actually a graph that I wanted to show Shaun. I talked about with him this morning, so I'm going to show you all the graph. But this was someone was talking about this yesterday, about as AI is changing the world of work, how do we prepare people for the future of the labor market? And what we know is that sort of jobs which require lots of routine cognitive skills are at risk of replacement through automation. And I think we have some really interesting evidence here, just in the graph on the left, where if we look at the occupational task content, you look at the task intensity, the routine cognitive task intensity of different jobs that people end up in their mid-30s based on their middle school GPA and their track, you see this sort of upside down U shape for those who are in the academic track. So if you have mediocre skills in middle school and you go to high school and you don't really specialize in something, you come kind of mid-level white collar job worker, you're actually really at risk of automation in a way that you are not if you go to the vocational track, because you're going to be working with people, you're going to be doing sales, you're going to be doing something which is not as easy to automate. So I think we really should be thinking about these skills as encompassing soft skills, things like sales, things about teamwork, which are hard to just capture by something like woodworking. So these are a broad range of skills, and I think Well, I'll leave it at that and let Shaun continue.
I'll just mention that the business programs still are a large part of high school CTE in the US, but they look much different than they did 30 years ago. So there's much more focus on finance and entrepreneurship, because the sort of like routine, less cognitively intensive, like business operations jobs in the US were offshored over the last 30 years. And so there's just not the demand for those. Health, IT, engineering programs that would encompass computer science and other applied STEM have been growing substantially. And I didn't sort of put that figure in here, but across the country, these are the hardest to staff from an educator standpoint, and we're related to the point that I made earlier. But like, for instance, in Tennessee, we see that there's high levels of turnover in health science teachers, and they're tough to replace, which means it's tough to train people without educators. But I mean, these are the places that also have the aligned post-secondary pathways that can, on average, lead to higher wages, though a lot of the health occupations are pretty low wage, and without additional supports don't necessarily lead to the sort of like stacked credentials and nursing sort of wages that we know would pay off. And then on the point about differences between males and females, in our work in Connecticut, all of the positive benefits we were finding were concentrated among boys, partially because the boys who applied to get into these technical high schools and didn't had really bad outcomes. So this was taking them, I mean, they were like 10 percentage points below the state average on high school graduation, much less likely to be in the workforce, earning very little when they were. But most of the boys were sorting into skilled trades, manufacturing, and transportation automotive programs. And so something like 8 out of 10 participants are males in those programs, where in contrast, 8 out of 10 are female in health and education programs. And so this is definitely a part of the story, and thinking about which programs engage which students, but also which programs pay off the most, right? At age 22, if you're in health and education, you don't get the same wage premium that you do in some of these other skilled trades. And so kind of how these things play out across the life course with respect to some of what Mikko's been able to look at with the Finnish registry data. I mean, we really have to wait and see to see how it plays out, but certainly there's evidence of difference.
Thank you. This has really been informative, and I really appreciate it. A couple of things. One thing, just generally, for a question that was asked earlier, is that I think you start it as soon as you can. Usually homeschool proves this. You start all of these voc things, life skills and stuff like that, as soon as you can, but then they dabble. Once a child hits about developmentally 14, then that's usually at the stage developmentally where they're like, what do I want my path to be? They start looking a little bit more futuristic at that time. Anyway, my son-in-law was raised in Massachusetts, New Bedford, Dartmouth area, and he went to, I'm guessing, a voc tech school all about engineering. And he is now almost done with his engineering degree out west where I live. And his brothers also went to this engineering school, and they are also pursuing engineering degrees. But what I've also noticed is that they're very entrepreneurial, these boys, as well. And they're very, now I don't know how much of it is a reflection of the parenting that they had, as in comparison to the practical skills. Sorry. So I guess my main question I'm trying to get to, I'm sorry. My main question I'm trying to get to with all of this is, so they've got these practical skills that seem to be pointing them in other directions. And I'm guessing, Jamie, you're probably the one for this. But they seem to be very innovative and character-driven, but not necessarily just in their main field. And they seem to be philosophically, how is... Do you see it doing that?
Yeah.
If you go into CTE.
Yeah, basically. Are we developing more practical intelligence skills that cross over outside of the field? Sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think that the sort of broad general background knowledge that these kids are developing through the academic side, I think encourage that in a way. But I think also the relationship between local businesses and these schools, I think unquestionably is helps have kids look at the rest of their lives in a way that is perhaps more entrepreneurial too. I mean, this group of schools in Massachusetts is by far the one that is most connected to the economy, to the market, and so it seems to me almost, it's like really the water in the aquarium in these schools.
I want to say one brief point, which is you mentioned something about dabbling until you specialize, and I guess a common theme of this conference is choice. It's hard to make choices unless you're informed about what your choices are, and if you've just been sitting in the classroom until age 16, you don't really know what the world is out there on the other side. And I think it's true, like exposure is something that we could get much earlier before we specialize. So I think that would be an interesting thing to think about, is how do you integrate vocational sort of dabbling into elementary and middle school coursework.
Thank you. I'm curious if data exists, and I'm hearing it probably wouldn't domestically, but maybe comparative data between some of the European countries, like Swiss model versus Finnish model, where Swiss is almost entirely employer-based rather than simulated CTE training, school-based environments, like comparative outcomes and also return on investment with potentially a lower cost to entry with an employer-based system.
There's so many differences between Switzerland and Finland that it's hard to sort of nail down what exactly is the difference driving those things. I haven't seen very sort of strong work in comparing the particular emphases of different programs.
Okay.
So the data you all shared and information you shared kind of looks at them and students in school and then the outcomes. Is there any kind of reverse research or data to show the high earning professionals in these fields, when did they start the VOTEC training, to kind of look backwards, like where did they come from, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. I guess the challenge there is if there's a reason they started earlier or later, and pinning down the sort of question of whether that would work for other people is something that it's hard as a sort of empirical social scientist to do. But I think there's probably room for more work there.
We'll just add that Mikko's work and then some of my own in Massachusetts and Connecticut does point out that whether or not you get access does matter. And so one might then extend that to think about how timing would matter.
Okay, in the back.
Thanks, Paul. So we hear a lot of rhetoric about the need for new pathways through high school over and over and over. How, as experts, do you respond to that rhetoric? When you hear it, what's your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all kind of devoutly to be wished for, but I think the devil's sort of in the details. It's got to be quality, and so giving kids more options that aren't high quality, I'm not sure always makes a lot of sense. But I mean, again, I get back to the academic quality here in Massachusetts. That it was really the game changer for this group of schools, and look, I mean, the reality is that carpenters and plumbers, they don't get, and electricians, they don't get outsourced, right? I mean, these are pretty stable jobs. They're connected to the local community. They really serve as the kind of backbone for communities, and I think matter for a lot of kids and families' lives.
Yes.
Simple question, kind of going along with the previous question. If you had to choose or had to advise school leaders deciding college prep or CTE, or is it an either or is it a both?
Yeah, I mean, at first glance, a lot of these kids don't come out with a huge college debt, for example. If they go right into the workforce, they don't have that. But look, I still think obviously college is enormously important, right? But I think the fact is that it's a great model. I mean, one of the things that's happened here in Massachusetts, and it's kind of become part of the debate, is that more and more kids are going to college from the voc tech schools. And I'll give you an example. 10 years ago, we did an event There was organized around U.S. history. It was covered by C-SPAN. The essay contest, we had 70, 80 applicants. You know, prep schools, charter schools, Catholic schools. The kid who ended up winning the $5,000 was from Voc Tech School, and she ended up going to college. But that tension is real, and the more success these schools have, the more the traditional public schools in the state is starting to kind of lean on them. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that tension, even within the Voc Tech world and Voc Tech policy, is real.
And I'll just add, I think highlighting that there is a choice, helping students and families understand what those different choices involve, and then destigmatizing and not prioritizing one versus another, I think is valuable.
I guess I was really asking, if you were starting a school or going to an existing high school, these mega destination high schools, would you recommend a school continue to do and try to do both, or specialize in one or the other?
I think what both the research from sort of Massachusetts as well as Finland suggests is that you want to have strong foundational skills. And what that means is that you can have that offered in the sort of academic portion of the high school. And I think it makes sense even to share some like common resources for that. Maybe some of the teachers can teach across people in both programs. But then having a strong capability of going deep and specializing is also, I think, important. So I think stretching yourself thin might be harmful, but having the strong foundations and being able to lean on each other could be helpful.
All right, so that sounds like the American Comprehensive High School. But we know that the American Comprehensive High School has lots of problems with it. So that's why we got the regional vocational schools, because the comprehensive high school for some kids that was sort of where you put people, it was a dumping ground, right? So how do you avoid the dumping ground problem it sounds very rational to create this two-track system and foundational skills building up to it. That's why we created it in the first place, but why didn't it work out so well?
I would argue it here in Massachusetts, part of it is setting a high floor, right? So not accepting a disinvestment in core general skills, expecting everyone to complete that, and then layering on elements of high quality. So I'll just add, in one of Jamie's slides, mentioned Chapter 74 approved programs. Most of the Voc Tech schools are wall-to-wall, these Chapter 74 approved programs. They have additional funding and additional requirements over what the federal government requires for something to be considered a CTE program. That's also part of what separates the quality, I would argue, those programs, the involvement of industry, lower student-teacher ratios, et cetera. So I think setting a high floor for general skills and then also layering on the highest quality elements of technical education helps avoid some of the pitfalls that we see, I'd say, in general in a comprehensive high school.
Yeah, and I would just say that the school autonomy, I mean, we know this from the charter schools here in Massachusetts and other places, but the school autonomy matters a lot. They really are, the regional Voc Tech schools are really sort of a freestanding district and don't have the sort of kind of bureaucratic entanglements that you find in many school districts. I mean, I worked for an accountability agency, and we always had this saying that, you know, schools don't reform themselves in isolation from the larger district. And an example of that here in Boston is that the Madison Park is sort of the pink elephant in the room. It hasn't, unlike Worcester, unlike Springfield, it hasn't been a model of urban Voc Tech reform, and it's because it's so baked into the bureaucracy of the BPS and sort of a command and control model that even when they get good leaders in there, the system wins every time.
I think one challenge, and something I alluded to, is that depending on which measure you have, the U.S. may have up to 25% vocational programs or 2%. And it depends on how you define vocational concentrators. And if you take 3 courses in a vocational program, to me, that's not enough to really be a specialist. And I think that's a fear when you have comprehensive schools, is that people dabble, but they don't go deep enough, and they don't really specialize in anything. They end up with the worst of all worlds. So in that sense, like, if you're going to have these programs under the same roof, you really have to provide the flexibility to have very different sort of structures of curricula for people in both programs, that not everyone is trying to basically look the same, but with slightly different emphases. So I think having the ability to really choose your program is important.
Well, you know, I want to follow up because I've always admired the Finnish system. You have a common framework up through what we call grade 10, and then the last 2 years of high school, you then choose one track or another. Have I got that right for the Finnish system? And is that a model that we might want to consider, that the idea that we have, you know, the same schooling all the way through to age 17 or 18, just we should cut it off at 15 or 16?
Yeah, so in Finland at age 16 you choose, and then it's a 3-year program, but it's exactly what you said. So up through age 16, everyone's in the same school, and then you choose. And I think in Finland you do get much more exposure to things like home economics, things like building things, or even starting your own businesses in middle and elementary school. So maybe you get some of that exposure earlier on, and then I think you get time to specialize. I think that's a model that could work. I don't think that's so different from the regional vocational sort of model that we have in the U.S. It's not that.
That's right, yeah.
In particular, something that hasn't come up explicitly, but you do have to make the choice to attend the regional voc techs, and the same is true in the analogous schools in Connecticut. But in 9th grade, you get a choice, or you get the opportunity to explore between 4 and 6 different programs across the whole year. And then, as Jamie had mentioned, there's this, ranking of preferences, and that's something that is closer maybe to the Finnish model and more distinct from the way this happens in most US schools, even in career academies where there are in principle multiple themes under one roof, but students get sorted into one or the other without necessarily having the chance to explore multiple before committing.
All right, so one last question.
Hi, my name is Michelle Barmazel, and I'm the president of the Massachusetts Association for Gifted Education. And we have a group of people within our community called Twice Exceptional, which is gifted with a learning disability. And I'm hearing about this, and so many of our kids would do so well in this type of environment. But they often, and because regular schooling doesn't work, so they're not getting the grades, they don't look gifted, but they really are. So that other part, the learning disability, if we're putting kids into that slot, the VOTEX area, would you think all these schools would have the ability to support these learning disabilities? And what do you guys think of that?
So I'll just say empirically, they can and they do, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, disproportionately serve students with disabilities. There is one regional voc tech in Massachusetts that has over 40% of its enrollment students with disabilities, compared to a statewide average identification of like 17%. In Connecticut, it's not that as high, but it's still like 30% above the state average for identification. And the students with disabilities tend to do very, very well. They tend to do best with students with like higher incidence disabilities, but there are specialized programs for students with more profound disabilities that also have some evidence of pretty good workforce outcomes after high school. And because lots of theories for this part of it is some of the services that require pullouts in comprehensive high schools get pushed into baked into the CTE model.
Well, thank you very much, panel, for